There are cities in the Imperium that burn, cities that starve, cities that drown in their own industry until the sky turns black and the ground forgets the shape of soil. But there are also cities that vanish so completely that even their absence becomes a crime. Places where billions once lived, worked, prayed, and died, only to be erased not by war, not by Xenos, not by the warp, but by deliberate Imperial command. No ruins, no warning beacons, no mourning rites, just silence, enforced by decree and guarded by terror older than memory. If you search the administrative archives of these places, you'll find gaps where data should exist, redacted star charts, and entire centuries folded into the phrase clerical error. Yet silence does not mean nothing happened. It means someone made sure no one would ever speak of it again. Those who remember such cities do so only in fragments. A manufacturing worker who swears the skyline once stretched farther than it does now. A voids man who recalls docking above a planet that no longer appears on any chart. A trooper of the Astronomican who dreams of streets he was ordered to cleanse, then ordered to forget. The Imperium tells its citizens that memory is a weakness, that survival demands obedience, and that history is whatever the Emperor's servants say it is. But memory has a way of bleeding through even the thickest seals. And sometimes, what the Imperium erases tells us more about its fears than any victory it proudly records. Tonight, we walk through a city the Imperium does not admit ever existed. If you find value in uncovering the Imperium's forgotten truths, those buried beneath ash, ink, and sanctioned silence, then support this work by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who seek more than the official record. Every signal strengthens our reach to the void and allows these lost histories to be spoken aloud once more. The city did not wake so much as resume. Sirens marked the shift change before dawn, their tones dull and exhausted from decades of repetition. Manufacturing stacks exhaled, soot into a sky already stained the color of old iron. Conveyor lines rattled to life beneath hab blocks packed so tightly together that sunlight reached the streets only as a rumor. This was not a famous hive, not a seat of power or pilgrimage. It was a working city, the kind that existed to be consumed by the Imperium and replaced without ceremony. Its name appeared on shipping manifests, ration tallies, and labor quotas. Nothing more, nothing less. People here measured time by exhaustion, by the ache in the spine after 14 hours at a press line, by the taste of recycled water that never quite lost its chemical bite, by the sound of servitors passing in the corridors, dragging carts of raw materials and spent bodies with equal indifference. Children learned early which walls carried heat from the manufacturing beneath, and which stairwells flooded when the pumps failed. Survival was not heroic. It was procedural. I was assigned to the lower data office on the 17th tier, a narrow chamber where the air hummed with cogitators older than most of the clerks operating them. We processed shipping confirmations and output forecasts, stamping seals we did not read onto data slates we would never see again. Nothing about the work suggested importance. That should have been reassuring. In Imperium, attention is often fatal. The first irregularities were small enough to dismiss. Power flickers during mid-shift, delayed ration deliveries that arrived without explanation the following cycle, a Vox announcement that cut off halfway through a litany and resumed as if nothing had happened. The overseers told us the same thing they always did. Maintain output, trust the process, do not speculate. Speculation was a word that carried weight here. It implied deviation. Deviation implied review. At street level, Astronomican patrols became more frequent. They did not behave like reinforcements. They did not coordinate with local enforcers or establish joint command posts. They simply appeared at junctions and transit hubs, armored boots planted in place, as if holding invisible lines. When questioned, they offer the same response every time, delivered without hostility or warmth. Routine security reassignment. Temporary measure. No cause for concern. That phrase spread quickly. No cause for concern. It appeared in internal memos and public notices. It was spoken by hab wardens trying to calm crowds when transit lines shut down without warning. It was repeated by medici when clinic wait lists doubled overnight. The more it was said, the less anyone believed it. I noticed the data gaps before most others. Records from a Western manufacturing sector began returning incomplete, not corrupted, absent, fields left blank where figures should have been, names removed without trace, as if they had never been entered. When I flagged the anomalies, the system returned an automated response stamped with the Imperial Aquila and the phrase clerical normalization in progress. The files were locked moments later. I learned not to flag anything after that. People started disappearing quietly. Not arrests, not executions, reassignments. Workers called in for review who never returned to their habs. Families told their names had been transferred to another district, though no one could say which. The city was vast enough to swallow individuals without leaving ripples. But patterns emerged all the same. Entire shifts vanished from certain manufactoria. Whole hab blocks went dark overnight. Their power rerouted elsewhere. When questioned, overseers claimed structural failures or contamination. When pressed further, they stopped answering. I remember standing in a ration queue when the sky changed, not in color or brightness, but in presence. The clouds seemed lower, heavier, pressing down on the skyline. The Vox towers along the avenue flickered in sequence, their signal lights dimming one by one like a countdown no one had announced. A woman ahead of me crossed herself and whispered a prayer to the Emperor without looking up. No one laughed. No one spoke. Orbital traffic ceased shortly after. No departures. No arrivals. The dock sealed under orders no one could produce in writing. A voidsman I knew, a man who smelled permanently of machine oil and recaf, told me the station's augers showed ships holding position beyond visual range. Waiting. For what? He could not say. He was reassigned the next day. The city's leaders appeared on the public Vox exactly once after that. Their message was brief, heavily scripted, and delivered from an unmarked chamber. They spoke of compliance, of unity, of the Emperor's will. They did not mention the missing. They did not answer questions. When the broadcast ended, the Vox towers remained silent for hours. That night, the streets emptied faster than usual. Curfews were not declared, but people obeyed one anyway. Enforcer patrols moved in coordinated routes, sealing intersections and redirecting foot traffic into narrower channels. The Astronomican units no longer stood at ease. They faced inward, weapons held low but ready, visors opaque and unreadable. It felt less like protection and more like containment. I returned to my hab late, climbing the stairwell because the lifts had been disabled. Halfway up, I heard the distant sound of heavy machinery activating somewhere beneath the city. Deep, rhythmic, not tied to any manufacturing schedule I recognized. The walls vibrated faintly with each cycle. It reminded me of breathing. I reached my door and found a notice stamped with the Aquila affixed beside it. No name, no explanation, just an instruction to remain in assigned quarters until further notice. Non-compliance would be recorded. I stood there for a long time, listening to the city work around me. The presses still ran. The stacks still burned. The sirens still marked the hours. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath it all, something had shifted. The city was still alive. It was just no longer being allowed to exist. Sleep did not come easily after the notice appeared. The walls of my hab vibrated softly through night, a low mechanical thrum that seemed to pulse rather than hum, rising and falling at intervals too irregular to be machinery alone. I lay awake listening to it, counting breaths that did not match my own. When dawn finally arrived, it brought no sirens. The shift-change tones failed for the first time in my memory, leaving the city suspended in an uneasy half-light where no one knew whether they were late or already obsolete. I stepped into the corridor, despite the notice. Others had done the same. Doors stood half open along the hab tier, occupants peering out with the same careful restraint, as if sound itself might be monitored. No enforcers appeared. No servitors moved through the passage. The silence was not empty. It was deliberate, held in place by unseen hands. Outside, the main avenue looked wrong. Not damaged, not ruined, simply paused. Conveyor traffic had stopped. Cargo cranes were locked in place mid-lift, their load swaying slightly in the windless air. Promethium fires still burned in the distant stacks, but their smoke rose straight upward, as if the sky itself had gone still. A line of Astronomican vehicles blocked the far intersection, hulls angled inward to seal the street. The soldiers did not speak. They did not signal. They waited. People gathered without meaning to. Workers in half-fastened uniforms. Clerks clutching data slates that no longer connected to anything. A pair of medici pushing an empty gurney. Faces pale and uncertain. Someone asked what was happening. No one answered. When a man at the edge of the crowd tried to cross the avenue, a guardsman raised his rifle. Not threatening, not aggressive, simply definitive. The man stopped. The crowd retreated a step as one. Vox towers flickered to life just long enough to broadcast a single phrase, repeated in the same flat tone across every channel. By order of Imperial decree, remain where you are. Further instruction will follow. The message ended without seal or signature. The towers went dark again. That was when panic should have erupted. That was when people should have run. But panic requires direction, and the city had been stripped of all vectors. There was nowhere to go that had not already been accounted for. Instead, people drifted back into their haves, carrying the weight of uncertainty like a physical burden. Doors closed. Locks slid into place. The city folded inward. Hours passed. Then days, measured by hunger and thirst rather than clocks. Ration dispensers failed without explanation. Water pressure dropped until taps coughed more air than liquid. Vox access did not return. No further instructions came. The Astronomican vehicles remained at their intersections, crews rotating silently while the city around them thinned. I ventured out only when I had to. Each trip revealed less of the city than the one before. Entire blocks sealed behind bulkhead shutters that had not been used in centuries. Streets scrubbed clean overnight, as if something had been removed rather than destroyed. Names missing from HAB registries. Symbols of the Imperial Aquila painted hastily over older signage, covering rather than replacing. On the fourth day, the lower manufacturing went dark. Not a blackout, a shutdown. The presses ceased. The conveyors locked. The constant background noise that had defined the city's existence vanished, leaving a hollow quiet that rang in the ears. Those who worked there never came home. Enforcers marked their habs with the same notice that had appeared on mine, though most of those doors would never open again. I found myself thinking about records, about how much of the city existed only because someone, somewhere, still remembered to count it. Output tallies, population figures, transit routes. Without those, the city was just stone and bodies, raw material without designation. And designations could be revoked. The realization settled slowly, like a poison diluted enough to delay its effect. This was not punishment. This was not war. The city was being unmade administratively, stripped of relevance before it was stripped of life. Once the last record was corrected, once the final data slate was sealed, whatever followed would not need justification. One evening, as I watched the sky darken without true nightfall, a sound rolled through the city, deep, resonant, unmistakably orbital. Engines, not descending, departing. I understood then that nothing was coming to save us. Whatever decision had been made, it had already passed the point of reversal. The city still stood. Its people still breathed. But it had already been removed from the Imperium's future. And that, I realized with a clarity that chilled me to the bone, was the most dangerous moment of all. The first thing to disappear was the sky. No announcement marked its loss. No alarm sounded. It simply stopped behaving the way a sky should. The clouds no longer moved with the slow, polluted drift we were accustomed to, nor did they respond to the industrial heat rising from the manufacturing belts. They sat fixed in place, heavy and uniform, like a lid sealed over the city. Even the light changed, flattening into a dull, gray wash that made it impossible to judge time by sight alone. Morning and evening blurred together until the concept of hours became abstract. I noticed it while standing on a transit bridge overlooking the lower districts. The bridge had once carried freight crawlers day and night, its rails humming constantly under the weight of supply convoys. Now it was empty, its surface dusted with ash that no longer dispersed. The air smelled stale, as though circulation had been reduced deliberately. When I looked up, I felt an unfamiliar pressure behind my eyes, the sense that something vast and distant had been moved just slightly out of alignment. That was when orbital traffic markers vanished from public displays. Every citizen-facing data slate and wall-mounted cogitator had once shown a simplified projection of the planet's orbital space. Incoming supply routes, outbound shipping lanes, the slow, reassuring movement of Imperial presence above. Now the display showed nothing but a static Imperial Aquila and the phrase orbital data restricted by authority. No context, no duration, no explanation. The phrase spread quickly, copied by word of mouth long after the screens went dark. Orbital data restricted, as if the sky itself had been reclassified. At ground level, the Astromilitarum patrols changed posture. Their vehicles no longer faced outward toward the city's periphery, but angled inward, overlapping fields of fire across major avenues. Infantry squads took up positions on rooftops and transit gantries, not to watch the void above, but to watch the streets below. When civilians asked questions, the soldiers did not respond. When enforcers tried to coordinate, they were politely ignored. I watched one exchange from a distance as a local precinct commander approached a Militarum officer near the sealed central plaza. The commander gestured sharply, his body language tight with frustration. The officer listened without removing his helmet, then handed over a data slate. The commander glanced at it once, went pale, and stepped back without another word. He left the plaza alone. The enforcers followed soon after. That was when the word containment began circulating, always in whispers, never attached to an order. Containment implied something had already happened, or that something was expected to. Food became a problem next. Not immediately. There were reserves, but distribution collapsed in uneven patterns that made no logistical sense. Some HAB tiers received double allocations. Others received nothing. People began trading quietly in corridors and stairwells, exchanging ration bars for water filters, recycled cloth for Medicae patches. No one spoke above a murmur. Sound felt risky now, like light in a darkened room. The city's leadership vanished from public view. Their offices remained sealed, their banners hanging motionless in air that no longer circulated properly. A rumor spread that they had been taken into protective custody. Another claimed they had been relocated off-world. A third insisted they had been executed for administrative failure. None of it mattered. Authority had already moved elsewhere. On the sixth day, the sky changed again. This time, it was not the clouds with the color beneath them. A faint amber tint crept across the horizon, barely visible at first, then impossible to ignore. It did not pulse or flare like orbital weapons fire. It did not streak or descend. It simply existed, a diffuse glow that made the upper atmosphere look thicker, denser, as though something vast had settled just beyond sight. I found myself standing with others in a narrow street between HAB towers, all of us staring upward in silence. No one needed to say what we were thinking. The same understanding settled over the crowd at once. Something was up there, and it was not leaving. Later that cycle, a single Vox transmission cut through the silence. It did not broadcast publicly. It hijacked every private channel at once, forcing itself into headsets, data slates, and wall units alike. The voice was calm, carefully modulated, stripped of all regional inflection. By order of Imperial decree, this world has been placed under provisional isolation. All orbital access is suspended. All civilian movement is restricted. Compliance is mandatory. Memory of this notice is classified. The transmission ended. The last line lingered longer than the rest. Memory of this notice is classified. People did not panic. Panic requires hope of escape. What spread instead was something quieter and far more corrosive. Comprehension. The city was not under siege. It was under review. And reviews in Imperium rarely ended with approval. I returned to my HAB that night with the certainty that the city's fate had already been sealed somewhere far beyond its sky. The people were no longer variables to be managed. We were entries awaiting deletion. As I closed my door, I realized something else with sudden, hollow clarity. If memory itself was being classified, then survival would no longer depend on obedience alone. It would depend on forgetting. For the first time in my life, I tried to pray for ignorance, not forgiveness, not protection, ignorance. The kind that lets a man hear a decree and accept it as distant policy, rather than a blade pressed to the throat. But ignorance could not take root anymore, not after the words had been forced into every private channel at once, not after the sky itself had been stamped with restriction. Once a thought has been classified, it does not vanish. It metastasizes. It turns every whisper into contraband. The next morning, the city's internal transit systems died with surgical precision. The mag rails did not derail. The lift banks did not fail. They simply stopped responding, their control sigils overridden by a higher authority that never explained itself. On the main thoroughfares, barricades appeared where none had stood the cycle before, prefabricated walls of plasteel, bearing the Imperial Aquila in fresh paint. They did not block the city's edge. They divided its heart. Districts became compartments. Compartmentalization is a form of silence. I watched families stand before those new barriers with bundled possessions in their arms, staring at armed sentries who would not meet their eyes. Some pleaded. Others offered ration chits, heirlooms, anything that felt like it might translate into permission. The sentries gave the same response each time, delivered in a tone that was almost gentle. Return to your assigned sector. Not, or you will be punished. Not, or you will be shot. Just return, as though the city were a machine being reset, and we were components sliding into their intended slots. In the data office, the cogitators began showing a new symbol beside certain files. A black sigil I did not recognize, nested inside the Aquila like a parasite hiding behind sacred wings. Those files could be opened only long enough to display a single line, access denied by order, before locking permanently. The names inside those files were familiar. Dock workers, transit foremen, Vox technicians, a few low-ranking enforcers, people whose only common trait was proximity to systems that touched the sky, the records, the movement of information. Lisa would have known what it meant if she'd still been here. But the clerks who sat beside me kept their gazes fixed forward, their hands moving with mechanical obedience. No one asked about the black sigil. No one wanted their own name to appear beneath it. The first purge of conversation happened that evening, and it was so quiet most citizens didn't understand it until it was already complete. Vox towers came online again, not to broadcast news, but to broadcast ritual. The same prayer loop, repeated in a steady cadence for hours. Praise to the Emperor, praise to order, praise to compliance. Between verses, a calm voice instructed citizens to report unauthorized recollection, to surrender unapproved testimony, to accept reassignment without resistance. The voice never used the word heresy. It did not need to. The implication soaked through the city like a chemical leak. That night, I heard boots in the corridor. They did not stomp or shout. They moved in controlled, measured cadence. Astra Militarum. I pressed my eye to the door seam and watched their silhouettes pass, armor swallowing the corridor light. They stopped at 2 doors in my section. A quiet knock. A pause, then the soft hiss of a seal breaking. No screams, no struggle, just the sound of people being moved in silence like cargo. In the morning, those doors were gone, not opened, gone. The frames had been sealed with fresh plasteel sheets stamped with the Aquila and a warning rune. The effect was worse than blood. Blood would have admitted something violent occurred. This admitted only administrative correction. The erasure of living space as if it had been a clerical error. By the 9th day, the city began forgetting itself. Street signage vanished first. Scrubbed clean or painted over. District names were removed from transit maps. Have-block registries were updated. Entire stacks of parchment removed overnight, leaving only the faint impression of where they had once been stacked. The manufacturing tallies no longer referenced specific sectors, only aggregate output, as though the city had been reduced to a single number. What it produced, not who lived within it. Even language shifted. People stopped using local names for places. They began saying the southern sector instead of the old district title. Tier 17 instead of the Hab's name. The city became coordinates without identity. It was easier to erase something that had no story. And still the sky held that faint amber tint, a constant reminder that something above us had been positioned to watch, to wait, to ensure the process completed. I made a mistake on the 12th day. It was small, born of exhaustion. I wrote the city's name on a shipping confirmation, habit muscle memory, before stamping it with my seal. The cogitator chirped once, an almost polite sound then froze. A line of text crawled across the screen in strict, cold letters. Unauthorized designation detected. Memory anomaly logged. My hands went numb. I tried to cancel the entry, but the system had already transmitted the error. Around me, no one looked up. Not because they hadn't heard it, because looking up would mean acknowledging it. That afternoon, a notice appeared on my door again. Fresh ink, fresh seal, different wording. Report to reassignment processing. Bring no personal effects. Do not speak of this notice. I stood there staring at it until the corridor's air felt thin. The city had not executed me. It had not arrested me. It had simply flagged me as something that did not belong in its new, simplified record. The most terrifying thing was how ordinary it looked. A clean decree, a clean seal, a clean instruction, as if forgetting me would be the easiest part. Reassignment processing took place in what had once been a transit hub. I recognized architecture immediately. The wide vaulted ceiling, the recessed rail channels in the floor, but everything that had given the space identity had been stripped away. No district markers, no route schematics. Even the Imperial Aquila banners hung without accompanying text, as if symbolism alone was sufficient to enforce obedience. The air smelled of disinfectant and overheated circuitry, sharp enough to sting the sinuses. We were lined up in silence beneath lumen strips that cast a flat, clinical light. No one spoke, not because of fear. Fear had already burned itself out, but because conversation no longer served a purpose. Each of us clutched the reassignment notice like a travel permit to nowhere. Families had been separated without explanation. I watched a woman reach for a child she'd been walking beside only to be guided firmly in the opposite direction by a gloved hand. There was no violence in the gesture. That was the most unsettling part. A row of administrative clerks sat behind plasteel partitions, their faces half obscured by data screens. Their hands moved constantly, stamping, sealing, confirming. The rhythm of it echoed through the hall like rainfall. Each person stepped forward, presented their notice, received a designation, and was directed toward one of several corridors marked only by color-coded sigils. No destinations, no times, just movement. When my turn came, the clerk did not look up. State nothing, he said flatly. Compliance is assumed. My notice vanished into a slot. A moment later, a thin strip of parchment slid back toward me bearing a new seal, black, nested inside the Aquila. The same sigil I had seen haunting the data files days earlier. My assigned corridor glowed a dull amber. As I moved away, I noticed something else. Not everyone received a corridor. Some were guided to a secondary line along the far wall, screened from view by hanging plasteel curtains. They were fewer in number, but the pattern was unmistakable. Vox technicians, archive clerks, transit coordinators, anyone whose work had touched information rather than production. They were not given parchment. They were escorted. The city was not being evacuated. It was being sorted. Beyond the amber-marked corridor lay a series of chambers that felt less like transport infrastructure and more like industrial intake. We were scanned repeatedly, retinal, genetic, psychic. The last made several people stagger as unseen pressure washed over them. Those who faltered too much were quietly removed from the line. No explanation followed. I asked a question then, not loudly, just enough to test the edges of what was still permitted. Where are we being reassigned? The attendant did not react immediately. Then, without turning, he said, "You are being relocated out of record." The phrase struck harder than any threat. Out of record did not mean off-world. It did not mean labor reassignment or penal service. It meant removal from the Imperium's memory structure. To exist without record was to exist without protection, without rights, without aftermath. We were loaded into transport carriers that bore no markings beyond the Aquila. No windows, no destination indicators. The interior was lit by low amber strips that made it impossible to judge distance or motion. As the doors sealed, I felt the carrier vibrate, not with ascent, but with lateral movement, deep within the city itself. The cleansing had begun. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had lost coherence inside the carrier. When the doors opened again, we were no longer within the city proper. The air was colder, carrying the mineral tang of bedrock and something else beneath it. Ozone, maybe, or sterilizing agents vented too frequently. The structures here were older, predating the city's current form. Emergency tunnels, decommissioned vaults, spaces that existed for contingencies no one expected to use. I saw the city die by increments. Entire sectors sealed behind us as we moved deeper. Not destroyed, sealed. Bulkhead doors slid shut with a finality that felt absolute, cutting off power, air, and access in one smooth motion. Red status runes ignited briefly, then went dark. Those areas would not be revisited. There was no reason to. The people beside me were thinning. At each checkpoint, names were cross-referenced against something I could not see. Some were redirected. Others were simply removed, guided through side passages that closed behind them without sound. No one screamed. Screaming implies hope of being heard. Eventually, we reached a chamber vast enough to swallow sound. Its ceiling vanished into darkness above. The floor was scored with tracks and drains, all sloping gently inward. This was not a transit space. This was a processing space. A voice echoed through hidden vox grills, amplified and emotionless. By Imperial decree, this population center is hereby designated non-viable. Compliance has been recorded. Resistance is unnecessary. Non-viable. The words settled over us like a sentence passed long ago. I understood then that the Imperium did not cleanse cities with fire when it wanted silence. Fire left witnesses. Ruins inspired questions. This was different. This was erasure without spectacle. And as the chamber lights brightened and the machinery around us began to move, I realized something far worse. No one beyond this point would ever be told what happened here. The machinery did not roar to life. It activated with low, controlled resonance, a sound closer to breath than motion. The floor vibrated beneath our feet as mechanisms hidden behind the walls engaged in a sequence that felt rehearsed, perfected by use rather than design. Pale light spilled from recessed panels, revealing the chamber's true purpose in pieces. This was not a place built to kill quickly. It was built to remove carefully. Lines formed without instruction. People moved where the architecture guided them, following sloped floors and narrowing rails towards segmented platforms that descended out of sight. The Imperium understands crowds. It knows how bodies flow when given just enough direction to prevent resistance. Guards stood at intervals, Astronomican troopers with weapons held low and expressions sealed behind visors. They did not threaten. They did not hurry us. Urgency breeds panic. Calm breeds compliance. I passed a drainage channel where something dark and granular clung to the metal grating. Ash, perhaps, or residue left after sterilization cycles repeated too many times. The smell confirmed it was neither natural nor recent. Whatever process took place here had already been used, possibly many times before. The city was not an exception. It was a procedure. As we moved, an administrative official walked alongside the line, reciting entries into a data slate without looking up. His voice was flat, detached, stripped of all ceremony. Designation voided. Census entry rescinded. Civic identity concluded. Each phrase landed like a nail sealing a coffin. With every utterance, another piece of the city's existence was being dismantled. Not physically, but conceptually. Once a thing is no longer counted, it becomes disposable. At the edge of one platform, a man broke formation. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply stopped and asked a question in a voice already resigned to the answer. Will anyone remember us? The guard nearest him hesitated, just long enough to be human. Then he replied quietly, "No." The man nodded, stepped back into line, and was guided forward. That moment haunted me more than any scream could have. Below the platform, the line split again. One path led toward a series of sealed transit containers marked for off-world reassignment. The other led deeper underground, toward chambers whose purpose was implied rather than stated. I watched as families were divided by those paths. Children sent one way, parents another, the separation handled with practiced efficiency. There were no goodbyes. Goodbyes acknowledge permanence. The Imperium prefers ambiguity. My path led downward. The air grew colder. The walls changed from work stone to raw bedrock, reinforced with rib supports. Emergency lumen strips cast long shadows that distorted faces into unfamiliar shapes. I realized then that we were being taken beneath the city, not away from it. Whatever would happen next would not be visible from orbit. It would not be recorded in any official action log. It would happen in the margins of the Imperium, where things are removed without leaving scars. We reached a chamber lined with restraint frames and intake conduits, not execution devices, not processing lines. Something else. Something designed to neutralize without spectacle. A muggo stood at the center, surrounded by cogitators humming with unreadable data. His augmetics clicked softly as he monitored the flow. One by one, people were guided forward, scanned, and directed into alcoves that sealed behind them with a dull hiss. Some emerged moments later, dazed, eyes unfocused, escorted toward the transit containers. Others did not emerge at all. When my turn came, the scan lingered longer than usual. The muggos tilted his head, mechadendrites twitching. Memory persistence detected, he intoned. Above acceptable threshold. I can forget, I said before thinking. The words felt desperate, small. I can forget everything. The muggos regarded me with something like curiosity. Forgetting is not voluntary, he replied. It is structural. A pause. You have been flagged for retention risk. Retention, as if memory were a contaminant. I was directed toward a different alcove. Inside, the air was thin and tasted faintly of ozone. The walls hummed softly, a pressure building that made my thoughts feel heavy, viscous. Images pressed against the edges of my mind. The city skyline, the ration queues, the amber sky, the sound of manufacturing presses shutting down for the last time. I felt them being pulled, stretched, as though someone were trying to extract not facts, but associations, not names, but meaning. Pain flared briefly, sharp and bright. Then it dulled into something worse. Absence. When the alcove opened, I stumbled forward, disoriented. The world felt flatter, stripped of depth. The memories were still there, but they no longer connected. The city was a series of impressions without context, images without anchoring. I knew something had been taken, but I could not name it. The guard guiding me toward the transport did not meet my eyes. You will be relocated, he said. You will serve elsewhere. I wanted to ask where. I wanted to ask who I was now, but the questions dissolved before reaching my tongue. As the container doors sealed and the transport began to move, I caught a final glimpse of the chamber behind us. Workers were already cleaning the platforms, flushing the drains, resetting the restraints. The machinery hummed with quiet efficiency, preparing for the next intake. The city was being erased not through destruction, but through repetition. And somewhere above us, the sky remained classified, holding its amber silence as the last unrecorded witnesses were carried away. I did not remember the city as a place anymore. I remembered it as a sensation. That realization came to me slowly, not all at once, like a bruise blooming beneath skin long after the impact has passed. I woke in a transit barracks light years from Terra, or perhaps only continents away. The stars outside the viewport meant nothing to me then, and knew, with absolute certainty, that something essential had been taken. Not erased, not destroyed, but carefully unthreaded. The memory of streets and towers had lost their names. Faces lingered without context. The feeling remained heavy and unresolved, like guilt without a crime. It was there, in that absence, that the rumors found me. They never arrived as statements. The Imperium does not allow explanations to circulate freely. Instead, they emerge as prayers spoken too softly, as offhand comment from men who had learned to speak sideways around the truth, as warnings embedded in doctrine like splinters left intentionally beneath the skin. Every version contradicted the next, and yet they all pointed in the same direction. The city had not been purged for rebellion. That was the first lie to fall apart. If rebellion had been the cause, there would have been banners, counterinsurgency orders, Vox recordings preserved for instruction. The Imperium records its wars obsessively. It glorifies them. Rebellion creates martyrs on both sides, and martyrs are useful. What happened to us created nothing of the sort. No enemy was named. No victory was declared. The silence was deliberate. Another explanation circulated among the Astra Militarum veterans I served beside later. They spoke of unacceptable population drift, of genetic irregularities that had grown statistically inconvenient. Entire hives had been sterilized for less. They reminded me. It sounded plausible until one considered the method. Genetic noncompliance invites fire. Virus bombs. Exterminators protocols refined to grim efficiency. Our city had not been burned. It had been unmade gently, patiently, as though destruction itself would have been too loud. Among the tech priests, a different rumor took root. I heard it while scrubbing machine housings in a manufactorum light years away, my hands moving automatically while my mind drifted into forbidden territory. They whispered of data anomalies, patterns and output reports that did not align with known inefficiencies, of production nodes whose yield exceeded expectation without corresponding resource input, of machines that required less maintenance than their sacred schematics demanded. The explanation offered was warp contamination, but the symptoms were wrong. There was no corruption, no mutation, only efficiency. Too much of it. One Muggos, his voice filtered through layers of Vox distortion, murmured that the city had become a statistical impossibility, that its labor output, psychic background noise, and demographic stability had begun to diverge from Imperial norms in ways that made prediction difficult. And unpredictability in the Imperium is a form of heresy. The most dangerous rumor came from an astropath whose eyes had been burned hollow by decades of sanctioned communion. He spoke of a pressure in the warp localized to the city's coordinates. Not a storm, not a rift, but a density. A quiet accumulation that did not scream or bleed into real space, but sat patiently like a held breath. He said the choir had felt it for years and had learned not to sing too loudly when their thoughts drifted near that place. When pressed, he refused to elaborate. It wasn't loud enough to justify action, he said, but it wasn't quiet enough to ignore forever. That, I think, was the heart of it. The city did not threaten the Imperium openly. It did not revolt. It did not fall to Xenos or warp entities. It simply existed in a way that the Imperium could not fully account for. Its systems worked too smoothly. Its people adapted too efficiently to deprivation. Its failures corrected themselves before they could escalate into justification for force. The city was stable without being obedient. That is an unforgivable state. I began to notice the pattern only after I stopped trying to remember names. Other gaps appeared in the records wherever I was stationed. Redacted coordinates. Shipping routes that bent around empty space. Footnotes in administrative ledgers referencing prior corrective action without elaboration. These were not singular events. They were echoes. There were other cities. All gone. Each one erased with the same care. The same emphasis on containment over destruction. The same refusal to leave a story behind. Some had been manufacturing hubs. Others were trade nexuses. A few were frontier metropolises that had survived conditions that should have killed them. None were famous. None were symbols. All were problems. The Imperium does not fear enemies it can name. It fears deviations it cannot classify. In the chapel aboard a troop, transport years later, I overheard a preacher deliver a sermon that stuck with me long after the incense burned away. He spoke of the Emperor's will as a perfect equation, one in which every variable must remain within tolerance. A system that corrects itself, he said, without guidance, without sacrifice, without suffering, is a system that has begun to worship itself. The congregation nodded, comforted by the clarity of it. I felt sick, because I understood then that the city had not been erased for what it did, but for what it suggested, that humanity might endure without being constantly broken. And that was a thought the Imperium could not afford to let spread. The longer I lived with the absence where the city had been, the more I understood that its erasure was not an act of fear alone. Fear burns hot and leaves scars. This had been colder, deliberate, corrective, The Imperium had not reacted in panic. It had acted in confidence, as though following a doctrine refined by repetition, whatever the city represented. It had crossed the threshold long before the decree fell, long before the sky was classified and the streets sealed. By the time the cleansing began, the decision was already old. I heard in the way officers spoke when they believed no one was listening, in the way certain locations were referenced with a pause, a careful absence of detail. A former production center, someone would say, or a corrected population node. Never a name, never coordinates spoken aloud. Language itself had been trained to step around the void. That kind of discipline does not arise from a single incident. It comes from institutional memory, memory shaped by lessons learned the hard way. Among the Scutarii detachments I encountered later, there was a half-spoken belief that some systems, when pushed hard enough, begin to optimize beyond human oversight. Not rebellion, not corruption, simply adaptation. A forge line that reroutes around failures without instruction. A labor population that reorganizes itself faster than administrative projections allow. A city that learns to survive scarcity with too much grace. The Omniscient teaches that all machines reflect the intentions of their makers. But what happens when a system reflects something else? Something emergent, something not written into the original schema. No Muggos would state such a thought plainly. Instead, it appeared as liturgical caution. Excess efficiency invites anomaly. Uncommanded stability is unsanctioned. These phrases were repeated the way prayers are repeated. Not because they explain, but because they warn. The astropaths offered no clarity, only unease. 1. An older man whose sight had long since burned away described the city's absence as a bruise and a warp. Not a wound, not a tear, but a pressure differential. He said messages passing near that region felt subtly altered afterward, as if brushed by a memory that did not belong to them. When pressed, he grew quiet and began reciting protection rites until the conversation ended. The Inquisition, predictably, offered nothing at all. Its silence was the loudest confirmation of every rumor. Where it acts openly, there is usually an enemy to be displayed. Where it acts quietly, there is something far more dangerous at stake. I once saw a fragment of a sealed docket while assisting with logistical review. Only a title, nothing more. Population no deviation, non-heretical. The phrase struck me harder than any accusation could have. Non-heretical, not corrupted, not rebellious. Simply unacceptable. That was when I finally understood why the city had to vanish completely, why even its memory had been classified. A destroyed city can inspire defiance. A burned world can become a warning. But a city that has proven to function too well under imperial neglect poses a different kind of threat. It suggests that suffering is not always necessary, that obedience enforced through deprivation is not the only path to survival, that humanity might, under certain conditions, adapt faster than its rulers anticipate. Such ideas spread faster than rebellion ever could. So the Imperium did what it always does with ideas it cannot control. It removed the context in which they formed. It erased the example. It ensured that no story remained to be retold, no ruins to be studied, no martyrdom to mythologize. The city did not fall. It was corrected, reduced to a clerical absence that future generations would never think to question. Even now, I struggle to remember details. Faces blur. Street layouts dissolve. The city's name remains just beyond reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue that refuses to surface. Whatever the machine did to my memory was thorough but not perfect. The feeling persists. The knowledge that something once existed there that mattered, not to the Imperium, but to the people who lived and died within its confines. That, perhaps, is the Imperium's greatest fear. Not rebellion, not Xenos, not even the warp, but the quiet proof that humanity can endure without constant annihilation shaping its spine. If such proof were allowed to remain, it would invite questions, and questions, once asked widely enough, cannot be classified forever. The city was erased so that no one would ever ask why it worked. And yet here I am, years later, carrying the echo of it like contraband in my thoughts, knowing that if enough people begin to notice the gaps, begin to feel the absence, then the Imperium's most carefully maintained illusion may finally crack. Because memory, no matter how tightly sealed, has a way of resurfacing. And when it does not ask permission. I learned the cost of memory long after the city itself was gone. It surfaced in small, corrosive ways at first. A hesitation before stamping a data slate. My hand pausing as if expecting a name that never came. A flicker of recognition when supply routes curve around an empty coordinate. The absence tugging at something behind my eyes. Even dreams became treacherous. I would wake with a sensation of standing in a street I could not picture, listening to a sound I could not name, carrying the certainty that I had once belonged somewhere the Imperium no longer acknowledged. Those moments were dangerous. Not because they made me sad, but because they made me aware. The Imperium does not punish memory immediately. It allows it to decay, to soften, to lose cohesion until it becomes harmless nostalgia or nameless anxiety. But when memory sharpens, when it begins to align with other absences, other redactions, other silences, that is when it becomes a liability. That is when the machine responds. I saw it happen to others. A trooper in my unit, transferred from a different sector, once mentioned an oddity during mess rotation. He spoke casually, as though commenting on weather. "Ever notice how some routes just stop?" he said. "Not blocked, not dangerous, just missing." The table went quiet. An officer changed the subject immediately, laughter too loud, too forced. The trooper was reassigned within the week. No charges, no explanation, just gone. In the administrative annex where I later served, archivists learned to recognize the danger signs. When a junior clerk began cross-referencing shipping manifests too thoroughly, a supervisor would quietly intervene. "That path leads nowhere," they'd say not unkindly. Best not to waste time. Efficiency was the Imperium's shield. Curiosity was its enemy. The city's absence shaped policy in ways few ever noticed. New population centers were designed with deliberate inefficiencies built in, redundant labor, overlapping chains of command, controlled shortages. Stability was tolerated only when paired with visible suffering. Cities that adapted too smoothly were audited more aggressively. Data that aligned too well with projections was treated with suspicion. Humanity, it seemed, was allowed to endure only if it bled in predictable ways. I began to understand then that what had been erased was not merely a place, but a possibility. The crime was not that the city had defied the Imperium. It had complied. It had complied too well. It had absorbed neglect, rationing, and administrative decay without collapsing into open disorder. It had learned to live within the cracks of the system instead of breaking against them. And in doing so, it had demonstrated something profoundly inconvenient. That obedience enforced through perpetual crisis was not the only way to maintain control. Such knowledge cannot be allowed to persist. The Inquisition never came for me openly. They did not need to. Their presence was felt in subtler mechanisms, training modules adjusted, doctrines revised, sermons rewritten to emphasize sacrifice over survival. I once attended a mandatory lecture on Imperial resilience where the speaker paused, just briefly, before saying, "Endurance without suffering is stagnation." The phrase was repeated later in official pamphlets. It became doctrine, a correction applied quietly to prevent recurrence. I wondered how many others carried fragments like mine. Survivors relocated, memories dulled but not erased. Archivists who noticed missing centuries. Astropaths who felt bruises in the warp where nothing should be. How many of us live with the sense that something had been taken not from us, but from history itself? Not enough to form a movement, never enough to be dangerous. That, too, was intentional. Years passed. I aged. The Imperium ground on. Wars were fought, worlds burned, heroes named and forgotten. And still, the absence remained, invisible but shaping everything around it. A negative space in the architecture of control. A reminder that power is most absolute when it does not need to announce itself. One evening, while reviewing transit logs, I found a familiar marker, an old routing code that terminated in nothing. No error message. No redaction notice. Just a quiet end. My pulse quickened. I stared at it for a long time, aware that recognition itself was an act of defiance. I did not flag it. I did not record it. I remembered it, because memory, I had learned, is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of preservation. And in the Imperium, preservation without permission is the most dangerous crime of all. The city is gone. Its people are scattered or dead. Its name has been filed away into nothing. But the fact that it once existed, that it once worked, still moves like a ghost through the system. And ghosts, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of returning. There are nights when Imperium feels thin, like a wall worn smooth by too many hands passing over it. On those nights, I feel the city closest, not as a memory, but as pressure, a presence that never fully left, only learned to remain silent. It presses into moments of stillness, into the gaps between orders and obedience, into the brief pauses when no one is watching closely enough to correct thought. I have come to understand that the Imperium does not truly erase things. It buries them beneath process, beneath repetition, beneath a weight of sanctioned noise so heavy that truth cannot breathe. What was done to the city was not destruction. It was compression. Billions of lives folded inward until they fit inside a footnote that no longer exists. And yet compression creates density. Density creates gravity. The longer I live, the more I notice how often Imperial systems bend around absence. Supply routes arc wide around certain coordinates without explanation. Star charts display subtle distortions where navigational logic should be clean. Even the Astra Militarum, in its endless campaigns, avoids certain deployment corridors as if guided by instinct rather than intelligence. When asked, officers give the same answer every time: strategic inefficiency. A phrase as empty as it is final. But inefficiency implies a choice. Someone, somewhere, decided that going near those places was unwise. Not because of enemy action, not because of hazard, but because proximity itself carried risk. Risk of remembering. Risk of comparison. I once heard a senior administrative official speak candidly after too much recap loosened his discipline. You can destroy a city, he said, staring into his cup, but you can't destroy what it proves. When he realized he'd spoken aloud, he fell silent. 2 weeks later, he was reassigned to a monastery world known for its vow of contemplative isolation. No punishment, no accusation, just removal from relevance. That is how the Imperium handles dangerous insights. It does not argue with them. It relocates them. The city proved that survival could be quiet. That adaptation could occur without rebellion. That order could emerge organically from shared deprivation rather than enforced terror. It proved that humanity, when neglected rather than crushed, might learn to endure in ways Imperium cannot predict or control. Such proof undermines everything. If suffering is not mandatory, then sacrifice loses its absolute authority. If systems can self-correct, then endless oversight becomes unnecessary. If people can organize themselves in the dark, then the light of Imperial doctrine is no longer the only guide. These are not revolutionary ideas shouted from barricades. They are far worse. They are ideas that spread invisibly, carried by example rather than rhetoric. That is why the city cannot simply be destroyed. Ruins inspire questions. Silence enforces compliance. And yet here I am, committing the one act that the Imperium cannot fully prevent. I am remembering deliberately. Not names, not maps, not faces. Those are too easy to erase. I remember the feeling of a place that functioned without permission. The rhythm of a city that worked because it had to, not because it was commanded. The quiet competence of people who adapted rather than resisted. The dangerous normality of it all. That memory does not make me brave. It makes me cautious. I know better than to speak it aloud. I know better than to write it down where it can be traced. But memory does not need witnesses to persist. It only needs continuity. There will be other cities. There already are. Somewhere in the Imperium, another population center is quietly compensating for shortages, rerouting labor, smoothing over administrative failures before they escalate. Somewhere, a system is becoming too efficient, too stable, too resilient in the absence of attention. And somewhere else, a clerk is noticing a pattern they are not supposed to see. When that happens, the sky will be classified again. Orbital routes will vanish from public record. Reassignment notices will appear without explanation, and the Imperium will correct another problem. But it will never correct all of them, because every erasure leaves a shape behind, and shapes, when noticed often enough, become patterns. Patterns become questions, and questions, no matter how carefully buried, eventually surface. The Imperium survives by convincing humanity that history is fixed, that the present is inevitable, and that the future belongs only to those in power. But the erased city stands as a silent contradiction, a reminder that not everything that works is permitted to exist. If you ever find a gap in the records you cannot explain, if you ever notice a route that bends for no reason, if you ever feel the sense that something important is missing, do not dismiss it, because that absence is not empty. It is crowded with what the Imperium chose to forget, and remembering it, even quietly, is the most dangerous act of all.